Hi everyone, going to get started. I hope everyone is well this afternoon, or if you're watching this on demand, whenever you happen to be watching it, I hope you're well. My name is Katie Jacobs. I work with HR leaders at the CIPD, and I've been hosting our coronavirus webinar series. And we've got a special bonus session this afternoon, where we're going to be talking to two really influential HR leaders about the bigger picture of the coronavirus crisis. What does it mean for how we're going to work in future, how we're going to think about work, and how the people profession itself will operate and be seen within organisations and more widely. We're also going to talk about the impact of this crisis on one of the UK's biggest employers, the civil service. We're going to look at how HR has stepped up to deliver organisational leadership at this really challenging time. The CIPD and civil service HR work closely in partnership to upskill, support and professionalise government-based HR practitioners. So joining me and all of you this afternoon, I'm delighted that we've got Rupert McNeil and Peter Cheese. Thanks, guys. I'll just do a quick introduction. As Chief People Officer for the UK government, Rupert has one of the biggest HR jobs in the country, responsible for the delivery of people strategy across the civil service. He provides leadership on the full range of people issues, so that includes things like talent, capability, inclusion, leadership, culture, and he's also Director General for Government Shared Services. And I'm sure that you all know our CIPD CEO, Peter Cheese. Peter is a highly respected writer and thinker on subjects like the development of HR and the people profession, the future of work, and issues of leadership, culture, organisation, people and skills. And obviously he's been thinking a lot about the impact that coronavirus is having on the profession and the world of work more widely. So thanks both for coming along this afternoon. And before we get into what I'm sure is going to be a really, really fascinating conversation, I'm just going to do the very quick housekeeping notes. So first things first, the session is being recorded. It will be available on demand, and you'll find it on the webinar section of the CIPD website. And you can also access all our previous webinars there and sign up for future sessions. Secondly, if you want to submit questions, and we'd really love to make this session interactive, could I ask you to use the Q&A box instead of the chat box? Feel free to chat to each other in the chat box, but if you want to ask any specific questions, it will be much easier for me to pick them up via Q&A. We're going to run this session informally, so that means there aren't any slides. Do submit your questions at any time you want, and I'll pick them up and I'll try and feed them in at an appropriate point. And finally, a quick reminder that the CIPD is continually updating our resources to support the people profession, and that you can find everything on our coronavirus hub. And we're updating it every day because things keep changing every day. So we're trying our best to be agile and fast and support you all, because we know you're all working incredibly hard to support your people and your organisations. So let's get started. Rupert, I'm going to ask you first, could you just explain a little bit of the context about your role and kind of the people function within civil service?
Sure. Thanks, Katie, and thanks for having me. So just to explain a bit about the civil service, first of all, and then how HR supports the civil service as one of its functions. So the civil service is really, I think, best seen as a sector or a subsector of the UK public service. It's made up of multiple organisations, let's say about 40 large employers of various sizes. Some of them enormous organisations like DWP and HMRC, some of the largest in the UK, some much smaller, of a few hundred or fewer people. So we've really got, in a sense, a microcosm of all the different work contexts that we have in the UK economy, whether it's somewhat a retail environment, if you think about job centres, call centres, offices, labs, workshops, factories, etc., across that whole spectrum. Now that represents around 345,000 full-time staff and around 102,000 part-time staff, and spread out over the country. The way the civil service works as a sector is that it's pretty federal. So I'm one of a number of functional leaders responsible for, if you imagine there's a one axis is the department that people are employed by, and then people also have a professional or functional identity that sits alongside that. Now, when it comes to what we've experienced with COVID, we were actually, I don't want to quite use the word fortunate, but we had some level of rehearsal for this, because we had been preparing for about 3 years for various configurations of the UK leaving the European Union. Some of those in a no-deal scenario. And that had really helped all the functions, but particularly HR, think about how to move people around government swiftly. And so it allowed us really very quickly to put resources into the Department of Health and Social Care, DHSC, and then to move people, for example, to deal with some of the big efforts that have been underway, whether it's supporting universal credit and benefits through DWP, or moving or setting up the furlough scheme out of HMRC. Two big things that have happened during this period, as well as that there, in a sense, there's a health and social care front to COVID, and there's a economic front to COVID, and both need to be supported and resourced. And we've learned a lot about ourselves through that process. We already had a sense of thinking about different departments' concepts of operations, to use a term the military use. Can you work call centres on a distributed basis with people remote working? Do you need to get people in to meet people physically? All of those things. And I think what we found is we've actually been really pleased to see that, in a sense, in 6 weeks, we've compressed what might have taken about 6+ years to do in terms of remote working and the cultural change. So this might be an interesting benchmark for people to think about in their own organisations, but I'm still a bit stunned by this percentage. 76.4% of the civil service workforce is working from home, and 16.2% are still working in their frontline roles. And there's a small number. We divided up the workforce into those who could start working from home immediately or very quickly. That's that 76.4% now. And then there were some people who we recognised just had to be in their posts, and we needed to make sure that was done the best way. And then there were two other categories, people who didn't have the equipment, so we need to get that to them quickly, and that was quite a logistical exercise, which we learned a lot about. And it's also taught us a lot about what we call interoperability. There's more that we need to be able to move people and work around the government estate between different call centres, etc. And then there was a category of people who couldn't work from home because they were in flat shares, or there were well-being issues, other things, and we need to make sure that they were accommodated as well. So the civil service has been working through all this time, as many employers have, and we've been sort of learning a lot through that. There's been a lot of join up between the functions, between the technology function, the security function, as well as HR and the estates. And that's actually a bit of a theme, which maybe we could pick up in our conversation, Peter, later, which is, this is really about the integration, which I know you and I have talked about before, of the enabling activities, whether it's where you're located in the workplace, the technology, the operations, how you want to serve the customer. And that's just been giving us very rich insights about this. Now, the other characteristic about this for us is that, although we can talk in the generality, the lived experience for colleagues can be very, very different. And one of my favourite conversations about this was with a colleague who said, if you think about it, I mean, I think Myers-Briggs is interesting as a bit of at a cartoon level. It's quite a helpful metaphor. If you're an eye, in a world which is dominated by extrovert right-handed males, discuss, then this is actually quite interesting. This is actually perhaps a bit more of an environment that introverts feel happier in. I just give that as an example. So that was a point that was made to me by one of my colleagues, and I think that's interesting as we look at the technology, as we look at the way, to some extent, interacting like this is actually quite leveling. It's leveling and quite non-hierarchical, I think, compared to some other modes, but it raises other issues. Are people actually being heard? How are we doing that? So people will know that with the CIPD, we've been very committed to our sort of inclusion agenda, and we've got some material which we'll be releasing, Katie, for other people to use. We call it Little Book of Inclusion. First book we've produced on that is on remote working and how to lead with a team that's distributed, because it does require different skills, and like everything that we deal with, it requires practice. We've been very pleased to see from the pulse surveys we've done that people feel broadly supported by their line managers, by their teams, and I think that's a really interesting question for me about how this has made things both help people to share and be more authentic, maybe. You see the rooms in which we live, and also to some extent more intimate. And I think that's fascinating. Are we actually going to go back to physical, sort of face-to-face physical presence, and find that the 2-meter distancing that will be in place and other things is actually going to feel a bit less intimate and friendly than the environments that we're in this type of call. We've actually we're now on, after several weeks, we're now on version 9 of our guidance for remote working. Been working very closely with our trade union partners, with departments, with all of the other functions to produce that. We meet as an HR function twice a week, three times a week, and we have calls with all of the representatives from all departments. That's been very helpful for us. And now we're moving into the guidance on getting back into the workplace and what that means. And again, people are going to be going back into many different contexts, and most people actually will probably, for the time being, continue to work remotely. So really fascinating time for us. And just to finish, Katie, on the broader context and maybe segue into our conversation, there's a sense for me that for government in the period between 2010 and 2020, we've had sort of 3 phases. A phase where we set up the functions between 2010 and 2015, a period when they were being embedded between 2015 and 2020. And that period was dramatically accelerated by all the work that had to be done around EU exit. And now we are in the next phase, which is accelerated by what we're learning through the COVID experience and how we respond to this new way of working. Now, what's interesting is that when we were talking about what we would need to focus on in the next phase of civil service workforce thinking, it was around greater collaboration, smarter use of technology, looking at a workforce that was much more distributed around the UK at all levels, senior and junior levels. And lo and behold, that's technology and location, and that's what's being accelerated at this time. So it's very exciting. We're really happy to share with people, and great segue into this important conversation about what happens next.
Thank you so much, Rupert. I really love the point that I'm hearing a lot in my conversation with HR leaders, that it's kind of sped up digital transformation, kind of put it on steroids, and you did 10 years worth of stuff in a few weeks. And it was exhausting, and it involved so much kind of inter-silo collaboration between kind of IT and facilities and HR, but it's we could really hold on to it, and it could make a really, really profound difference to the way we work in future. Peter, could you offer some opening kind of reflections on how this has been for the kind of profession more widely over the last, I'm losing track of time and it's all melding into one, but 10 weeks?
Yeah, it all sort of blurs into each other, days and weeks, don't they? But thank you, Rupert. Lots of fabulous observations and reflections, and many, many common themes, of course, that we're hearing across all kinds and shapes of organizations. And but what we're consistently hearing is that HR itself is very much at the center of the organizational response, and HR leaders saying, and HR people at all levels saying they've literally never worked harder. There was an interesting article in The Economist a couple of weeks ago that compared the global financial crisis to this crisis. And so the global financial crisis shone a massive spotlight on the CFO, if you will, and this one has shone a massive spotlight on the CHRO. And I think it's because this crisis is fundamentally a crisis. It's a human crisis, and it's something that therefore has made us all reflect, whether business leaders and everybody else, I think, so much more on what I even think of as humanity at work and people at work and the importance of people. And all the points you made, Rupert, about how this has encouraged us to connect in different ways, and not least because we're staring into each other's living rooms and things like that, and how much more we've had to think about our connection, our support to our people, how much more mental health has become a very, very central agenda, and well-being a very central agenda. So that's something which I think is really positive and encouraging. We are hearing very consistently from HR people and business leaders that this is putting people front and center of the business agenda, and all the way up into ideas like purpose and meaning, and even we may get onto it, sort of bigger ideas of corporate governance and things of that nature. So those are the encouraging things. And as you said, other obvious dimensions that are emerging are what I think of as the shift of paradigms of work, which we have had for 100 years or more, almost since the Industrial Revolution. The idea of work being something you broadly do 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. You go to work, you work, and you come back. And it's been incredibly hard to break those paradigms. And as we've in recent years talked more and more about technology and enabling different ways of working, remote working, trying to encourage part-time working, and so on, which is so important for several reasons. One, you touched on, which is inclusion, because the more you do those things, the more you create inclusion and opportunity for people from all walks of life to participate in work. But it's also vital to our stress and our mental well-being, because again, if you look at the paradigms of work, with all the technology we've had in recent years, it has not seemed to have either improved the challenges of presenteeism or stress at work. And indeed, both of those have been steadily climbing. And we've seen all the evidence for that. And so what really strikes me about this, and to echo your thought about the crisis forming a catalyst and accelerating change in organizations, is I think we're going to see that much more broadly across the whole economy, because the reality of so many of these things, the presenteeism, of engagement, of diversity and inclusion, of flexible working, things of that nature, we have talked about those for a long time. And yet, if you actually look at the data, the amount that the needle has moved on many of those themes over the last 5 or 10 years has been far too little. And now here we are in this situation. We couldn't have predicted it. I mean, we may talk about the extent to which it was a white versus a black swan, but nonetheless, it's caught so much of us by surprise. We've had to adapt very quickly, and we've learned a great deal from it already. And it seems inconceivable to me that we would go back to some of the things of how we've worked in the past. And that, even if we take that example of yours, I mean, it's an incredible statistic, 74% of the public sector working from home. I think across the economy, it's close on 60%. We need to learn from this and say, these are different ways of working which can be very, very good for people. I don't think there's any evidence that productivity has dropped. Of course, it has in some circumstances, but those are old paradigms as well, old beliefs, that people from working from home weren't really working from home, they were shirking from home. They weren't really productive. And yet, I don't know, I'm sure you find it, I certainly find it, I think I'm more productive arguably now than I ever was before, not least of which because we can jump from meeting like this to the next meeting. We don't have to travel and all those other things. So there are lots of other dynamics at play at this point in time. But I'm a glass half full kind of person. I think, and to go back to old adages like I think Winston Churchill first said it, didn't he? He said, "Don't let a good crisis go to waste." And I think this is the sort of opportunity that we can see for our profession, for organizations everywhere, and most important for people right across all spectrums of society and across the economy. And I think we've got to help to lead for those kind of positive outcomes as well.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to go actually straight on to a question that's come in because it picks up really well on something that you were talking about. So somebody's asked about, do you believe we've passed into a new world where there'll be genuine flexibility for people about where and how and even when they work? And I know there's been a lot of conversations going on about, will we be going back to normal? Obviously not in the short term, but how do we kind of hold on to a lot of the more positive aspects of flexibility? And Rupert, have you got any reflections and perhaps any practical pointers on what you're doing to hold on to some of those?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. It's a great question. So the phrase which, so it's interesting the way new phases and eras produce phrases that captures concepts you weren't thinking about before. So interoperability is one that we talk about. It's not particularly snappy, but it gets the sense of everything needed to work in a sort of an integrated way. But a catchier phrase is one that's been used in the conversations that we've been having at the senior level in the civil service among the director generals, thinking actually about civil service transformation. And I would say there is a strong consensus that we don't want to have a snapback. So that's what we're guarding against. How do we, we know the Kurt Lewin model. You you unfreeze, change, and refreeze, and we just need to make sure it does not snap back. And I'm actually real like Peter. I'm a glass half full person. I don't think it will or can snap back. Partly because we're going to need to be very vigilant about what happens when we move into the next phase. Which of the 4 readiness states are we going to be in? We're going to need to think about that. And I think about other changes that have happened. I don't know whether it's too crude a parallel to make, but the world changed a lot after 9/11. We thought about security in a different way. We thought about security a different way during the 70s and 80s with domestic terrorism then. And it's that type of thing which I think drives this response. So I think it will. I think we can't afford for it not to stick, actually, and that then raises some interesting questions about how do you make sure that happens. Well, clearly, what leaders do is hugely important. I think it's also important to recognise that people will have just very different experiences, and we should try and so maybe it also moves towards the individualization of the employee experience, which Peter and I talked about this before, but the mass customization, if you like, of the employee offer. How do you allow people to work and live the way they want to? In the civil service, that's one of our USPs that we can do, and we're very, very keen on doing that. Personal observation about it is, ironically, I think I'm like Peter. I'm probably more productive because of the lack of downtime. I'm actually much more disciplined about my hours and when I work at the weekend and other things. And I'm finding that it's helpful to be more compartmentalized than perhaps I was previously. And the sort of self-generated presenteeism, consciously suppressing it.
That's interesting. So do you feel you have a better balance personally at the moment?
I really do. I tell you, the fact that you've been given permission by the Prime Minister to go out and have 1 hour's exercise, and now more, is you make use of it.
Yeah, I know. I was reflecting on that the other day. I don't think I ever normally went for really long walks, and now I'm definitely getting in 1 walk a day. Peter, in terms of kind of capturing that more flexible way of approaching work, how can we ensure that we don't, as Rupert put it, snap back, but we rather kind of bounce forward, I guess?
Yeah, I love these expressions. Snap back is one, pivot's another, and are you still on mute is probably another one which we're all getting very familiar with. But it's a really important point. I think first and foremost, it's about what we said before. If we really understand what we've learned from this and we bake that into our thinking about our operating models, our cultures and everything else, we would absolutely understand that keeping these more flexible ways of working is absolutely inherent to that. I'm sure you've done this, Rupert, across the civil service as well. We've been asking many questions of our organisation about how do they feel about this, what would they want to do, and something like 60% plus say actually they are very happy working from home. Of course, you've got those segments, as you described, who find this very hard for all sorts of reasons. We have to acknowledge those people as well. But the majority, in most cases, say, you know what, yes, this is working pretty well, which is not to say, we saw an announcement earlier from Twitter saying they're going to make it a permanent thing of working from home. I think the answer is that it's a blend. You give people choice, and that's the absolute essence of this. You give people choice. So that idea, as you said, Rupert, of mass customization, and which is, after all, what the younger generations are coming up into the world and expecting anyway, and all sorts of things to how they interact. So I think it's keeping true to those sorts of ideas and recognizing the value of choice and how it helps people to be productive, because it's supporting well-being, it's supporting inclusion and all of those other ideas. But I think the danger sign's also there. I mean, we know that as this sort of steady encouragement of returning to workplaces, it's going to test, because there are many businesses who are finding it extremely hard. They need people at work or in the workplaces to operate at all. So they're going to be putting pressure on their people to come back. And whilst we can talk in the context of organizations like public sector, which is predominantly very people-driven, it's a knowledge-based economy and so forth. Obviously, in sort of things like manufacturing or hospitality services, where you need people at work, that's where the challenge is going to be greater. And it's not, I think the real innovation will come when we even think of environments like that, where we can shift and flex working patterns. So it may be you're still going to be there, but you can flex your working patterns much more, and we don't have to be so much in these rigid paradigms of work. But that's where I think the test will come. And of course, as we've been talking about this a lot over the last several days with communities about the programs of returning to work, and workplaces, and the guidances we have to put in place. And then the great worry said, well, what's all the legal support for this? Well, of course, one of the first questions that people are asking all the time is, can I force, in quotes, or can I be forced to go back to work? And the answer is no, you can't. But it doesn't mean to say there won't be a lot of tensions between organizations and leaders who are driven by the need for their business to keep going and needing people at work. But I think as we're both agreeing, I mean, and as we've always talked, I mean, the idea of keeping true to these principles and what we've learned from that, and the humanity at work, and why these things are beneficial, I think have to be our guiding lights.
I think that brings us really nicely onto a question that's come in, saying that as well as seizing the opportunities and the positives of how we've adapted to ways of working, there are some, I think, inequality risks that have been identified. I think what you were just touching on, Peter, about the difference between who can work from home and who can't. Do you, either of you, have any thoughts on how we can mitigate those, Rupert?
Well, we've been having very good conversations, useful conversations with our staff networks about this. And I think this is one of the really big issues for us nationally as we come out of this. What does it mean for, particular demographics? What does it mean for people who are over 70? What does it mean for people from some groups who might have been affected more dramatically, and including people doing certain types of job? So it's we're very alert to it. And I come back to it and saying it's my sort of health warning on everything I put out on this in my internal conversations with the civil service leadership is, but individual experiences vary widely, and that's, I think, that's the key. Back to what Peter's been saying about individualization, and we're going to have to look at that stuff really, really carefully. And will it actually be, will it actually act as a catalyst? Here's another glass half full point to ask about those issues in other contexts, not just in the context of COVID, and recognise the needs of those groups. One thing I did want to just say, Katie, Peter, is that a few things that have happened that I think are really interesting in the public sector, which are interesting from a sort of policy perspective. One is what's happened on homelessness and how that's been looked at differently, and the fact that GP appointments are being done virtually, that large chunks of education are being delivered virtually. These are really, again, these are things that would take decades to look at in a different context, and are throwing open and up all sorts of interesting questions about what we do when we're out of this particular stage of the response. But great question.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Peter, about?
Yeah, I mean, just to add a couple of thoughts to it. It is a really, really important question, and as I've talked to communities of D&I leads, I talked to one of the big civil service communities on D&I recently about this, and there's genuine concern, because if we took an example like returning to a place of work and then recognizing that, but that could be, if we don't look at it through an inclusion lens, we might, I mean, an obvious example might be, well, we'll take the people as easiest to return. So, for example, people with mobility issues or whatever, harder to bring back. So it'd be quite easy to sort of forget them. But there's also some other very, maybe arguably slightly more subtle ones and less sort of visible, perhaps through the normal lenses of D&I, like this debate that's emerging about, well, of course, many people who need to work in a workplace could not so easily work from home. So your middle managers, your white collar staff, to use the old vernacular, much more likely to be able to work from home than your so-called blue-collar staff. So how do you make that fair? How do you balance it? And as I said before, I think in any workplace, in any circumstance, you can still find ways to provide flexibility, and we just need to be a bit more creative and inventive. So I think that the truth on the D&I one is, yes, I think there is a danger it begins to get a bit lost in all the debate about just the logistics and practicalities of returns to workplaces or whatever. So the most important thing, I think, of all of in that regard is that we keep that lens on it. We as HR professionals keep that lens. I think we've done a lot in recent years to understand the diversity of our communities, and we must keep doing that now. So that whenever we look at any shifts in working patterns and the like, we are applying that D&I lens to it to be sure that we're being fair. And as you said, Rupert, too, obviously the other way is we just keep this open communication, open channels, we're sharing it, we're learning from our people, all those other things which we know are anyway good practice, and in this context become ever more important.
Thank you. Rupert, a couple of specific ones about civil service HR. So I'm going to put them both together. So somebody's asked about, do you think this will generate a rethink on what needs to be face-to-face based HR service within the civil service? And somebody else has asked, what would HR in the civil service need to do differently to ensure we move forward from this rather than snapping back?
Yeah, so two very good questions. So I think the first thing is that the approach that I'm taking and putting out as the assumption is that there is actually no HR process that which HR professionals, 3,500 of us in the civil service do, that cannot be done virtually or remotely, and that should be the default. And that we've had a bit, we've put that in place now. If I take an example, we have accelerated development programs, and we have some particular accelerated development programs for some particular demographics, protected groups. And most people were sort of fine to go with that. Some people were a bit reluctant, but I think when people had experienced it, they actually were very confident in us doing it that way. So that's the default. That doesn't mean that there won't ever be residential training, for example, or you won't have to have face-to-face interactions. But I did my first big 2 days of interviews for a post, an HR director somewhere in government, and that was done completely online through Zoom, and was fine. So I think that generally this is the future for that, and I suspect other functions will find the same thing. What do we need to do to make sure we avoid the snapback? Well, we need to keep doing that ourselves. And I think we need to be, in a sense, surfacing all the issues that we've been talking about on this call so that leaders and others understand why we mustn't snap back, and just keep communicating. I like, Peter, your analogy with the 2008 as being the CFO's time and this being the HR functions time. I think what's come out to me, not just in the civil service, but looking across all of the UK's HR community, and actually talking to counterparts in the Republic of Ireland and other places as well, there is a professional body of knowledge and capability associated with HR which is being leveraged now. The return on that investment is happening now, and we just need to keep doing it.
Thank you. Following up from that, Peter, somebody's asked, how would you advise an HR professional to encourage leaders to allow working from home to continue, so to kind of have that move forward? How can we influence?
Yeah, really important point, and I love that word influence, because a lot of what we have to do is influence, and indeed it's one of those skill sets that we put at the heart of the profession, behavioural sort of skills things, our ability to influence. I think the reality is, as we've recognized, there is a spectrum of people. There are business leaders who totally get this, understand why it's important and all the rest of it. But there are at the other end of the spectrum, the doubters and the cynics, and we know they exist as well. I think the first thing is as much evidence as possible. So you do these surveys of your workforce and you ask them, how do you like working from home? Do you feel more productive? Are you better connected or whatever? All those sorts of questions. And you use that as part of your evidential base to support the argument with perhaps the more skeptical of business leaders that thinks that we need to move back, or as you said, Rupert, to snap back. But I do think, as I said, at the very heart of this debate now is about this whole notion of people and well-being. And I have long been an advocate of the view that one of the most important outcomes for any business, and indeed society more broadly, should be well-being. And if we go back to, and some of you will have heard me talk about this before, I mean, the history of the CRPD itself, which has its antecedents in what was known as the Welfare Workers Association 100 years ago, and they did what it said on the tin. They worried about people's welfare. And I think we've forgot a lot of that in the intervening years. It's definitely come back strongly in recent years and it's now being accelerated by this. So the other point I would therefore make about influencing business leaders is the need for transparency. And I'm a very strong advocate, and have been for a while, that we have to shift corporate governance. We have got to get, you know, the absolute essence of what a responsible business is, or organization is, built much more strongly into our corporate governance. Now, for private sector companies, you know, and the new regulations, or the updated regulations around the Company Act, which is requiring directors to show that they are understanding the short and long-term impacts of their business and what they're doing to all of their stakeholders, being more transparent on what and how we treat our people. So there are those sorts of pressures as well that are coming in on businesses everywhere to say, you've got to step up to this, you've got to show that what you're doing is right. You have to do that anyway because of some of the, you know, the increased attention coming from regulators on it, on corporate governance. But finally linked to that thought is that we are all under scrutiny now in ways we've never been before, as business leaders, as HR leaders, because there is a very high expectation that we are going to do the right things. There's a very low tolerance now for anything that's excluding or not treating people fairly, because we all see this is a very human crisis. So I think it's those external things we need to draw on as well to influence a business leaders' thinking, or organizational leaders' thinking, to say, this is a moment we're going to be under scrutiny. We've got to show that doing the right thing delivers the right results, and we're going to be held to account for that across all of our stakeholders, not least our own people and our own employees.
Thank you, Peter. You've got something to add, Rupert? We got.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise one thing, and agreeing actually what Peter said, and how we think about, just taking a step back, and how we think about what is happening now. So this is a pandemic, and Peter and I were sort of joking about this before. I was out for my constitutional and heard someone saying, oh, this is a black swan event. It is not a black swan event, right? It's a white swan. We knew this was going to happen at some point. Or, I mean, there are many people on this call that would have been having conversations about pandemic readiness, SARS, swine flu, all of those things. My grandmother and her nurse both caught flu in 1918. She was 12. Her nurse died. What happened with that flu in 1918? It was first of all, the second wave was worse than the first, and it hit young people. This is a disease which is disproportionately affecting older people. That affected disproportionately younger people. And you know, one of our jobs, you know, we talk about HR being strategic and strategic influence and business partners. We need to be ready for these types of big externalities that have an impact on the organizations we're supporting, and also the risk of congruent events. Now we had a very interesting exercise within civil service HR, which I would encourage every HR team to do, whatever their organization, which is, we said we need to look at all the things that could happen at the same time. And actually, one of the things we had was, we might be leaving the European Union, and there might be a pandemic, and there might be X number of other things. And it's a really good exercise. And I would say, when you then go to and there won't be a better time as we're coming out of this, to go to leadership teams and say, okay, we've looked at this, and this is what we need to do to prepare our business continuity plans, to be thinking about that. So I'd encourage everybody to look at what's expected of us as HR professionals in our business continuity plans, make constructive suggestions about how we can make our organizations more resilient and tougher. And two final things on that. A very interesting description I was reading in one article about what have we learned about the NHS through this period. The NHS, and there'll be many people on this call better qualified to talk about than me, but the NHS has proved that it is tough. It's a tough organization that's been very resilient. It's been hard. It's been, you know, people have been incredibly professional, but boy, is it tough. And as a good thing, as a virtue. And you've got so we've learned that. Nicholas Taleb, who wrote The Black Swan and Fooled by Randomness, and great books that every HR professional should read, talks about this concept of organizations being anti-fragile, tough organizations. And part of our job is to keep the engine running, keep people in our organization safe, exercise a duty of care, and make sure they are as tough as possible. It's a really good opportunity for us as HR professionals to take a step back and think about how we'll do that going forward for when the next thing happens, because there will be a next thing.
Well,
thank you.
Yeah, just adding to that thought, Katie.
Sorry, I'm just going to ask a question that I think you will answer, because Rupert just answered it, but I think it's a really great question, so I want to ask it. So somebody's asked about how do we ensure as a profession that we're not defined as rescue and response, as they put it, and that rather that we strategically drive the future people agenda in a leaderful way, which I think you answered really well just now, Rupert. Peter, could you pick up on that as well as your next point?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of both and, isn't it? Because I think your point, Rupert, about resilience is so important, and we do have a very fundamental role, and I think we've all seen that, because when you were describing it before, that and I hadn't quite thought about it in this context, but all the work that had been done under Project Yellowhammer and the Brexit stuff had actually prepared the civil service for this kind of eventuality in ways that we probably wouldn't have imagined before. And what we have seen across many, many sectors of the economy is because of the drives to efficiency and all these other things, that the resilience in our supply chain systems, for example, is minimal. There's no buffer stocks anywhere. It's all just in time. Too much short-term thinking in businesses where they're not investing in the longer term and resilience of infrastructure and things like that. And then when it comes to people and resilience, and this is where HR's role becomes so important, there are lots of different things to think about. And I would start with one which is not always talked about, but is the notion of trust. Because again, something we've learned a lot through this crisis is that we have had to trust our people to get on and do stuff. And a lot of the innovation that we've all seen in our organizations is because we have, in some cases for the first time, properly empowered. We have properly trusted people to get on and do what they needed to do. They had to adapt rapidly with their teams for very different circumstances. So I think trust is an absolutely critical element of any businesses or any organization's ability to respond, that you trust your people trust the leadership. And that is a fragile commodity. And then, of course, you've got all of those other things that you would naturally think about, the more strategic response of resilience, which is understanding your operating models, contingency planning, your ability, as you said, Rupert, your ability to be able to reconfigure the organization quickly, move resources around, balance your workloads, things of that nature, which, to be honest, again, because we've had such a drive in the private sector towards efficiencies and all those other things, just not very good at. And then finally, it is that ability to understand at even sort of slightly broader level in order to be able to redeploy people quickly through crisis. What are the skills and capabilities people have? And that, I think, is another really interesting thing that's going to come out of all of this. We've had too much, arguably, lots of specialization, lots of specialist skills, and the growing future of work and jobs pointing more and more to that. What we are seeing now, and some of the really exciting innovations that's happened across businesses, where we know that across different sectors, you've got what would be classically described as a V-shaped recovery, U-shaped recovery, or an L-shaped recovery. So if you take airlines and what they've been doing, for example, with retailers, saying, well, we can't employ all of our people, but you know what? They've got great customer services skills, which would be brilliant to support where there is increased demand, say in retailers. And that points to something different about our understanding of skills, an underpinning of what you might regard as the core or transferable skills that we need to be calling out much more. So I think those are part of the strategic response as well. But so I would say that I'm in between those two ideas, that we need to be able to understand the short-term impacts of resilience, but also the strategic way of thinking about organizations to make sure that we are resilient for these future events.
Thank you. Picking up the point about the function, I'm going to ram a few questions together because we've had quite a few. Have you got any reflections on how the HR function itself will need to transform in terms of the skills and perhaps functionally how we're set up? And somebody else has also asked about, do you think there'll be any emergent roles to come out of this? So new HR job titles type thing. Rupert, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think almost certainly yes. I'm not sure what they are, and I think that. But I think what can I say? I think that this has just reinforced the fact that there is a lot of stuff happening at the interface between service design, workplace design, technology, and the human people element. And I think this just shows that as HR professionals, and I've talked about this in other places, the HR profession of 2030 could be much more multidisciplinary profession. We might be sharing it with some other professions as well. So I think that's definitely a theme. What do we expect from the HR business partner as, if you like, curator of the employee experience on behalf of the organization? That's I think something we're definitely seeing. I think there's a lot around data and analysis and around what it means. I mean, the appetite. We spent a lot of time. Maybe I'm going to make a slightly facetious remark, but we've had a lot of years and years of people complaining about HR policies and their existence. And now, aren't we discovering a massive appetite to be told what to do? So part of our trick is not to respond to that, but actually to help people, trust your good judgment. We'll help you, we'll give you advice, we'll influence you, but really this is for you to decide, and we'll help you, rather than go to sort of rigid guidance. So lots of there'll be lots of interesting roles, and I hope lots of people will move. Well, there'll be much more fluid movement into other places like facilities, technology, etc.
Peter, what do you think on kind of how it's going to change our profession?
Yeah, I mean, just to reflect, first of all, on that rules and policies one, Rupert, you're right, and I've long advocated the view we should have a bit of a bonfire of our policies, because that has driven too much of our thinking in the past, and actually it doesn't influence all the right behaviours. We have a classic case now going on, don't we, with all these returns to workplaces guidelines and people expecting a manual to tell them exactly what to do in every circumstance, and you can't. And so much of this is about human behaviour, and unfortunately what makes it difficult is a lot of these distancing things are very unnatural to us. So you have to trust, you've got to get people understanding principles, their individual responsibility, which is another thing rules tend to work against. If I've just got a ton of rules and just obeying rules, I'm supposed to say, yeah, but what's my personal accountability for this? So I think you've got those things, but as you said more broadly, I mean, interesting thought about what new job titles might emerge. Will we have chief crisis officer or something? I don't know, but I agree with the general points, Rupert, that I think at the heart of it will be a strengthening of these more strategic areas, if you will, and organizational design, job design, things of that nature, the whole employee journey, employee experience thing. Those will become strengthened. Management of change, which is, of course, linked to crisis response, also will be really strengthened. But I mean, at this point in time, and who knows, things will emerge, of course, but I think as we've reflected, we've looked back at our profession map, looked at the areas of development, and I think it still holds us in good stead. We've talked so much in recent years about grounding ourselves on the right behaviors, the right core knowledge, which range from things like influencing skills and ethical judgment, all the data and analytics that you talked about, links to business and business understanding, cross-functional working, all those sorts of ideas. So I think that a lot of the foundations are there, but it's going to be a harder push and indeed a pull from the organizations that we support to build our capabilities in a lot of these areas. And I think particularly what you might bound in some of this more strategic OD, organization design, operating models, job design stuff, plus underpinned by good analytics and understanding. And then, as I say, this broader idea of our role in HR, which I think is a really important one, is being the real advocates, champions, supporters of how you manage change and all the cultural dynamics that sit behind that. And those are things which I think will get strengthened as well.
Actually, I want to ask a nice question about change management. Because obviously you reflected really early on in this conversation, Rupert, that we were able to make really big change really quickly. So do you think that there are any practical lessons we can take from this in how we manage large scale change at pace, given it proved that it can be done?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'm still really thinking about this, and I'd be grateful for any suggestions. I think my immediate reaction is to say, don't take for granted that opportunities like this will occur very often. And I think we've been very, again, fortunate seems the wrong word to use, but circumstances have conspired in the context of the public service to go through EU exit readiness and then this. and we've been able to ride that. So the main thing is know when, and there'll be micro examples of this, but know when there is when there is an appetite, and drive through the gap to make the change. Now, I would say there is something which is quite noticeable for me, which is sometimes the door to push through change in a culture is wide open, and people still feel that the door's shut. And so it's made me think that there are probably many more occasions when we could be pushing things through and pushing at open doors than perhaps we think. I'll definitely be reflecting on that.
Peter, can you pick up on that and also give any advice on how we can encourage leaders to develop their skills and behaviour to support new ways of working and change and uncertainty?
Yeah, which is also a great point. I mean, just on the change one, I mean, change happens both top down and bottom up, and I think an awful lot of change, certainly big change we've thought about in the past, rather too much is top down. You know, we've got to structure it all programs, we've got to tell everybody what to do, we've got to communicate the hell out of it and all the rest of it, and the sort of 10 steps of what we're all supposed to do. You know, a lot of what we've seen, again, what we've learned through this crisis is a lot of fantastic change can happen bottom up as well, which doesn't mean to say you've got to keep those two things somewhat aligned, of course, but there's no doubt that releasing the innovation of our organizations and trusting and empowering people more is the real essence of so much effective change. And I've often reflected on models, and there probably are people on the call from, say, the MOD, but the way the military has thought about this for many years is this mission, command, mission, objective idea. So I've got clarity on what I'm doing. I've trained my people, including my managers, down to the lowest level of management as to how they are supposed to act and what they would call situational leadership. So I've trained them, and I train them properly on these sorts of things. And then I empower them within that framework to do the right thing in the right context and take action and to help change to happen. And I think those are sort of dynamics of change which we haven't always well understood. And if I'm really honest, it comes back to this trust idea, that we talked about trust, but trust like it only goes that way, that you're supposed to trust me as you're my team member or whatever, versus the other way, which is also do I trust you? And the more rules we write and all the other things we've done tells people they're not being trusted. So I think that's a very important dynamic. And then I've forgotten the second question.
It's about developing leaders. Any advice?
Yeah, developing leaders. Well, absolutely. Oh, gosh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, we've all learned. I've learned. I'm sure Rupert has. We've all learned as leaders to do this about communication, about sharing, about. And if I take a simple adage again from the past, that often leaders thought that their job would say, well, I've seen this before, and this is what we've got to go and do. Well, I've never believed in that view because the world is changing so fast, and certainly in this context. If it's taught us anything, it's taught us more humility as leaders. And I think that is one of the real learnings for leaders going forwards is we don't know everything. And from the idea of humility says, so you've got to reach out, you've got to connect, you've got to engage, you've got to listen, you've got to learn. And those are attributes of great leadership that we've talked about for a long time. And again, I think that this crisis can help to reinforce those ideas. And then link it, as I said, to that idea of trust. So through humility comes that idea that I have got to trust and I've got to empower. And I think those are very broad messages for leadership that I think have, again, got very reinforced through this crisis.
That was a lovely, I've lost it in the comments now, but somebody put a nice a comment or a question about, do you think that this is making us bring our whole selves to work a little bit more? Because we're literally in
definitely.
You're in my living room right now. You can see my poster of Danish chairs from the Danish Design Museum. I'm going to, again, blend a few questions together. So we've had a few about, obviously, embracing change is really positive, but not all changes are positive. How do you think we can look after people who are finding some of this remote working quite detrimental to their mental health, so feelings of isolation? And I'm going to tag on to that. How do we help people deal with grief? Because this is an incredibly kind of human health crisis. And Rupert, what are you doing in the civil service to help with these?
So, a couple of thoughts on that. So, again, the individual experience is going to be very, it's going to be so different, and it's very easy. I'm speaking personally, to forget. So we noticed something early on in this process, which was that there was the people who've been dealing with this from day one. So for me, my introduction to this was the Cabinet Office, 70 Whitehall, ground floor cafeteria coffee place, sitting with the permanent secretary from DHSC and the chief medical officer, and they're saying, this was like in January, this thing is coming. Look, we need these people like now. That's quite a small ask. That's my first encounter with it, and of course, we went and provided the people they needed, and that started us on the route. But we noticed that those of us, they were sort of in the inner ring, and then we were in the next ring of people who were aware of what was coming. And there was a period of people not really getting what was coming, just as we hadn't initially. And then the dangerous thing was when you had people who were in those two groups in the same room, and they had sort of internalized this, and other people who hadn't yet internalized it. And that may be very thoughtful about how we deal with some other things like that. So have we absorbed the change? I mean, I'm not a huge fan of the Kubler-Ross grief curve, but it has a place, and that was, an example of it. People were further along the curve with this. So we always need to think that there are people who are at different points on the curve, and there are people for whom the experience of working from home or not being in the office is going to be isolating. The impact on people with different neurotypes is relevant as well. All of those things need to be considered. And really that comes back to good line managers and good colleagues being supportive, and you should know which of your people in your teams might be in that category and what they might need, and the check-ins. So I've been really pleased to see, the virtual check-ins. Perhaps people are checking in more with their teams than they would have done if they were physically present, and that's been a really important thing. And that comes back maybe to a general thing. Ultimately, human resources. I'm actually quite a fan of human resources as a title, because the human bit is so important. The humanity is so important, and our job is to be, structured, organized application of humanity and humane principles in the workplace, and all of those things need to be taken into account. So I feel very strongly about this, which is probably why I'm not being very articulate about it. But it's really important.
Very articulate. I think that was a great answer. Sorry, I'm going to have to bring this to a close. I'm just going to ask one more question and put it to both of you. So somebody's asked, do you have any advice for HR professionals themselves who are feeling overwhelmed at the huge tasks ahead? And I know that's something we're hearing from so many of the membership, that people are just exhausted, and there's still so much more to come. And while you answer that, could I also ask if you could offer maybe a personal reflection on what's kind of helped you in terms of self-care, because you're both in really big roles, managing big teams, big organizations. So how are you looking after yourself? And Peter, I'll put that to you first.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, recognizing and acknowledging, as we've both said, that HR has been so much at the center. So we shouldn't forget ourselves. And actually, it has some other parallels, because I've often said, and some of you may have heard me say it, that HR has been too much of the cobbler's children, and we haven't invested enough in ourselves. And that's one of the reasons why I'm hugely proud of the relationship that we have with you, Rupert, and the Civil Service HR, because that is putting back into the profession to grow our capabilities collectively. And that absolutely applies to well-being as well. So we need to look after ourselves. And from the CIPD perspective, we've been doing a lot to support that. I agree with everything that Rupert said. It's much more on the agenda, but specifically to provide helplines and support helplines, well-being helplines to our own professional membership. So we must look after ourselves in that regard and take on board what we're also trying to encourage others to do. And finally, very quickly for myself, I'm slightly worried of two perspectives. One is I'm definitely fitter because I'm exercising quite a lot more, but I'm probably also drinking a bit more. So I'm slightly worried I'm going to come out as a rather fit alcoholic. But the other thing that, to be serious, is really, really important, that has sustained me so much, is my family connection. And I recognize how lucky I am. The fact I got my 3 adult daughters, they're all in their 20s, they're all back at home, which has had their stresses and strains, but it has been absolutely amazing to provide that support for me, so I can switch off. I can go spend time with them. We have family connection. We do all sorts of crazy stuff together, and that has been really, really good for my mental well-being. And finally, to your point, Rupert, about switching off and switching, that ability to make sure it doesn't all become a seamless blur of work. and that opportunity to disconnect, spend time with family, has been an absolute blessing. And I think we're closer as a family for it as well.
Thank you. And for you, Rupert, advice for kind of HR professionals, but also reflections from you personally.
Yeah, and I sort of pulled them together and really sort of echo what Peter said. I think nurture and value human connections, and one of the connections that everyone on this call has is we are all members of a professional community. I think we're very fortunate, thanks to Peter and Katie and all your colleagues, that there's a good supportive infrastructure there with CIPD. So there'll be people in your organisation that you should be connecting with and sharing with, and connecting with friends and family as well, accepting that this is a particularly challenging time because of separation and distancing, but one which probably sort of throws that into its value into sharper relief. I'd also say a question that Peter and I have sort of talked about, and I think we do want to sort of try and build up as a profession. We're looking at it in the civil service. We don't know quite what it looks like, but the idea of finding more opportunities for people to have channels for reflective discussion with their peers, and to sort of, we carry a lot of load in these jobs compared to some other professions. People earlier in their careers are exposed to bigger issues, maybe, and that's something I think we really want to try and we should find ways to recognise and support. But human connection, that's the thing.
And that's a really, really fabulous place to end, I think. I think we could have probably gone on longer, and I'm really sorry that I didn't get to everybody's questions, but I tried to combine and be clever about asking as many of them as possible. This webinar will be available to watch on demand, hopefully from this afternoon, or if not this afternoon, then tomorrow morning. So please do feel free, watch it again, share it far and wide. Thank you so much, Rupert. Thank you, Peter, for giving up your time. I can see from the chat that people thought that was a really great session. So thank you very much for taking part, and thanks everybody for watching, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Thanks Peter.
Thank you.
Katie.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right.